The siege on Gaza and the war on facts is ongoing, and in search of facts, I found this report, and it's been my nighttime reading for the last 4 days. It's the report that's famously nicknamed the Goldstone Report. It was written by the United Nations fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict based on the Israeli siege of Gaza in late 2008 and early 2009. More specifically, it was headed by the very famous jurist Richard Goldstone, who also happens to be a South African Zionist Jew. Goldstone was the former first chief prosecutor of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal, where he convicted, among others, the leaders who headed the massacre and ethnic cleansing of more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslims in Srebrenica in 1995. This report sheds some light on how Israel reacted on much smaller scale so-called Palestinian provocations. I have personally highlighted some of the Israeli violations mentioned in this report's 452 pages to share with you. The report frames the general blockade of Gaza as such. Page 16. The blockade comprises measures such as restriction on the goods that can be imported into Gaza and the closure of border crossings for people, goods, and services, sometimes for days, including cuts in the provision of fuel and electricity. And on the casualties of this Israeli siege, the report highlights on page 16 and 17, Israel deployed its Navy, Air Force, and Army in the operation it codenamed Operation Cast Lead. Based on the extensive research, non-governmental organizations placed the overall number of persons killed, referring to the Palestinian casualties, between 1,387 and 1,417. And when it comes to the Israeli casualties, the report mentions, according to the government of Israel, during the military operations, there were 4 Israeli fatalities in southern Israel. And then it notes 9 Israeli soldiers were killed during the fighting inside the Gaza Strip, 4 of whom as a result of friendly fire. And now we get to the part of the report that mentions Israeli war crimes. Page 17. On the information available to it, the mission finds that the attacks on these buildings, referring to the Palestinian parliament and the Palestinian main prison, constitutes deliberate attacks on civilian objects in violation of the rule of customary international humanitarian law. There's been a lot of claims about whether or not the Palestinian armed groups are using hospitals for military purposes. Let's see what the report had to say about what happened back then. On page 18, it mentions the mission did not find any evidence to support the allegations that hospital facilities were used by the Gaza authorities or by Palestinian armed groups to shield military activities. So what about Israel's use of white phosphorus targeting hospitals and then claiming that Palestinian armed groups are using hospitals as launching facilities? On page 19 it says, the mission also finds that on the same day the Israeli armed forces directly and intentionally attacked Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City and the adjacent ambulance depot with white phosphorus shells. The mission finds that no warning was given at any point of an imminent strike. The mission rejects the allegation that fire was directed at the Israeli armed forces from within the hospital. And a question that's been asked by some repeatedly, especially by our good colleague Piers Morgan, who asks about the right proportions. You might find some clarification here. On page 20, the firing of at least 4 mortar shells to attempt to kill a small number of specified individuals in a setting where large numbers of civilians were going about their daily business and 1,368 people were sheltering nearby cannot meet the test of what a reasonable commander would have determined. The mission thus considers the attack to have been indiscriminate in violation of international law. And on the further killing of innocent civilians and targeting places of worship, the report remarks on page 20, the mission further examined an incident in which a mosque was targeted with a missile during early evening prayers, resulting in the death of 15 people, and an attack with flechette munitions on a crowd of family and neighbors at a condolence tent, killing 5. From the facts ascertained in all the above cases, the mission finds that the conduct of the Israeli armed forces constitutes grave breaches of the 4th Geneva Convention in respect of willful killings and willfully causing great suffering. Another claim that we often hear is that Palestinian armed groups are using Palestinian civilians as human shield. Let's hear what the report had to say. On page 22 and 23. The mission investigated 4 incidents in which the Israeli armed forces coerced Palestinian civilian men at gunpoint to take part in house searches during the military operations. The men were blindfolded and handcuffed as they were forced to enter the house ahead of the Israeli soldiers. Published testimonies of Israeli soldiers who took part in the military operations confirm the continuation of this practice. The mission concludes that this practice amounts to the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields. So how does Israel treat its innocent Palestinian civilian captives? On page 23, civilians, including women and children, were detained in degrading conditions, deprived of food, water, and access to sanitary facilities, and exposed to the elements in January without any shelter. The men were handcuffed, blindfolded, and repeatedly made to strip, sometimes naked, at different stages of their detention. After all of these allegations of war crimes, how does Israel investigate the violations committed by the Israeli armed forces? On page 34, it does not comply with the internationally recognized principles of impartiality and promptness in investigation. The fact that proper criminal investigations can start only after the operational debriefing is over is a major flaw in the Israeli system of investigation. Lastly, what about internationally and locally recognized NGOs, or media for that sake? The report mentions on page 279, to date, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem have been denied access to Gaza to collect data for their independent investigations into allegations of war crimes committed by both the Israeli forces and the Palestinian armed groups. So, the report does mention more Israeli violations and even few committed by Palestinian armed groups, but these were the most notable ones.
Well, I think the common element is dehumanizing the victims. I think if you don't dehumanize the victims, you can't behave in that way in respect of people. That's certainly been the lesson of my recent life, the last 20 years. War crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, discrimination, oppression generally, just can't happen without dehumanization.